And hello again, and welcome back to episode 7. We are still in group 2, but there's good reason for that. There's an awful lot going on in Eden and the surrounding area. We are going to finish looking at the plot today and then move on to the Cain and Abel story, and that will conclude our treatment of group 2 and get us ready to move on to the flood. When we left off last time, we had just discussed what is freedom and who gets it. That's one of the ancient Near Eastern primary concerns, and we looked at how the Eden story addresses that primary concern, and this was the visual that we used, where there were 3 things in balance, the law being this minimal restriction that ensures human flourishing for all. So what is freedom? It is this, and it leads to the possibility of human flourishing and the possibility of delight. And who gets it? Well, that's the amazing thing. Everyone. That is what we saw looking at this primary concern. But now we're going to move to what is God like? And see how the Eden story addresses that huge question. We're going to do, as we have often done, look outside and inside the text. Looking outside means looking at contrasts with what was normal in the ancient Near East, and inside means looking at the literary structure as a clue to what the author felt was important about the story. So we'll start with outside. And let's remind ourselves, when we're dealing with the question, what is God like, let's remind ourselves of what normal was back then. The normal gods of the ancient Near East were self-centered, fickle, vindictive, and capable of betrayal. Not only betraying each other, but also the humans, as we'll see when we get to studying the flood story. Now, in a world with gods like that, morality, like what's the right thing to do, becomes a kind of desperate guessing game, where you end up thinking things like, I hope this is what the gods want today. And in fact, we do have indications that this really was desperate. Here is a prayer from the ancient Near East that was dug up, translated, and here it is. It takes up the whole page here, but I think it's important for us to understand what normal felt like for the average person. May the fury of my Lord's heart be quieted toward me. May the God who is not known be quieted toward me. May the goddess who is not known be quieted toward me. The transgression I have committed, I do not know. The sin I have done, I do not know. The forbidden thing I have eaten, I do not know. The prohibited place on which I have set foot, I do not know. The God whom I know or do not know has oppressed me. I am troubled. I am overwhelmed. I cannot see. Man is dumb. He knows nothing. Mankind, everyone that exists, what does he know? Whether he is committing sin or doing good, he does not even know. Now, I hope you can perceive the anxiety that is all through this prayer. And it's an anxiety that comes when right and wrong depends on pleasing gods who are constantly changing their minds and are likely to zap you when you guess incorrectly. So, against that, we have looked already at some contrasts between the normal ancient Near Eastern view and what's being presented in Eden. I would like to remind us of a couple of them. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, God says. Yes, of course, there is the restriction about the one tree, but the fact remains, all the beauty and almost all the food in the garden was made by God for people. This was an astonishing contrast. So no wonder the place was called the Garden of Delight. Eden, of course, related to the word for delight, the Garden of Delight, because God provided all kinds of trees pleasing to the eye, good for food. And then God's first words were basically, this is all yours. So, what is God like? God is a provider. That's one thing we have seen. A freedom giver. Then we also saw that God complains in the Eden story, which is not surprising, actually. Ancient Near Eastern gods are constantly complaining. God says, it is not good. But here comes the contrast. God doesn't complain about the work that has to be done. I don't want to do this work. I want to create human slaves. No, that's the usual complaint. No, the complaint is, it is not good for mankind to be alone. God is concerned for the people. And then he goes about fixing the problem. God has already provided at this point in the story beauty and food and freedom. And now God provides intimate, side-by-side companionship. What is God like? God is a loving provider. And now let's move to some contrasts that we haven't quite looked at yet. And we'll start with this prayer that I just read to you from the ancient Near East. Notice that the man and the woman in the Eden story couldn't possibly pray that prayer. This one, riddled with anxiety. No, the man and the woman in Eden, they know exactly what is forbidden. They don't have to guess. They are precisely the opposite of troubled, overwhelmed, and blind. Instead, they are loved and they are free. What is God like? God is an anxiety reducer whose love provides deep security and whose love is the foundation for true, free personhood. But being truly free means you can make bad decisions, and the man and the woman do that. You can sin. The man and the woman sin. So this is a very crucial moment to ask, what is God like? What is God like when we mess up? Notice, while the man and the woman are in hiding after they have sinned, God is still walking and delighting in the garden in the cool of the day. This is not a God that's on the hunt for disobedient slaves, an angry God out hunting. No. And God, notice, does not force the people out of hiding, as I might be tempted to do if someone was, silly enough to be hiding behind a tree after doing something really bad. I might be tempted to say, get out here. But no. God calls to the people and they answer. God does not accuse them, notice. God asks questions and then they confess in response. In other words, God never once treats them in a way that robs them of their dignity. Instead, at all times, God speaks to mankind and womankind in a way that preserves and affirms their free personhood. What is God like? God is a dignity preserver, even when mankind and womankind are at their worst. And just before removing them from the garden, we see God do something for them they were unable to do for themselves. We've discussed this. God covers their shame and provides protection. The Lord God made garments of skin for the man and his wife and clothed them. They couldn't make decent clothes. They tried, but the fig leaves were not working. God provides decent, good clothing. He perceives, even notice, again, this is when they are at their worst. God perceives their vulnerability and responds with, not anger, with compassion. This is after they disobey. I keep saying this, but it's really important to notice. The people did not earn this treatment. This is just the way God is. God still cares. God still provides protection. What is God like? God is loyal. God does not let go. So the Eden story's answer to this big question, what is God like? At first we notice, if we're in the first valley of the Exodus with the ancient Israelites, at first we might notice the contrast. God is not distant, fickle, and angry. But eventually, hearing this story over and over, hearing it told over and over, we would begin, along with the ancient Israelites, we begin to absorb that God is a loving provider, a beauty creator, a freedom giver, an anxiety reducer, and a dignity preserver. This is what God is like, proclaims the Eden story. God's laws are minimal. They're there, but they're minimal, designed only to ensure the flourishing of all people. And even when we are at our worst and the consequences are real and are dire, even then God responds with loyalty, compassion, and protection. God's loving character can be known and it can be trusted. Again, there's no way, if you absorb the Eden story fully, there's no way you can pray that anxiety-riddled prayer from the ancient Near East. This is not just good news for the ancient Israelites. It is, but it's not just good news for them. It's also good news for all of us. Now, we have been thinking about this story in the context of the First Valley, the empty Israelites, in terms of being a people, being the people of God, being a nation. This is what they needed to hear to begin their journey as a nation. But this story was written down in the form that we have today in the Second Valley, in exile, when they had it all and then lost it all. And one thing that is rather interesting is just remember that these are archetypal stories, so people will hear themselves in the story. That's how it is designed. That's how it's supposed to work. Well, the Israelites in exile, notice when they look back on their story, notice what happens, and notice how it sounds just like the Eden story. At first, they were nothing, and then they were, as a nation, created out of the dust of slavery. Out of the dust of slavery, God created a nation, and took them to the east, to Eden, and planted them, put them in a garden there, a land flowing with milk and honey, clearly a land of delight, and they settled there. But then things broke down as they started to reach beyond what they were supposed to do as the people of God, and then relationships broke down. The relationship with the land was lost. The relationship with their family was lost. And eventually they find themselves east of Eden, as they are in Babylon, which is indeed east of the Promised Land. So they go from the dust of slavery to the east to Eden, and they settled there. And then they were taken, when all broke down, east of Eden to Babylon. And it is here, when they fear that all is lost, when they have been so bad and the consequences are so dire, it is here that they have the courage and they have the faith to write down the story of Eden. And it is a way of proclaiming there is hope when we can remember what God is like. Well, all of that from the plot in Eden, and now we move to the Cain and Abel story. And we're going to start with the text right away and then have some interruptions. The man made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Cain sounds like, by the way, in Hebrew, the word for brought forth. Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. Now, at this point, we may be tempted to ask ourselves, well, why? Why does God favor the one and not the other? And at this point, we need some help again from, Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Yes, of course. So here's the situation. John Walton, we've talked about him in the last episode, in his NIV application commentary on Genesis, he wrote something very helpful, I think. We need to practice, when reading a story like the Cain and Abel story, we need to practice the discipline of reading the lines instead of reading between the lines. I have heard a lot of discussion about why God may have preferred Abel's offering to Cain's, but the text has no interest in exploring this question. That's what John Walton is saying. In fact, John Walton says all that we've read so far, leading up to Cain being angry and his face downcast, is just setup. That's just the setup, and the true story begins after that. How will Cain respond to this disappointment? That's the question, and that's the story. So, what comes next then is when we read the lines, let's just proceed here. When we do read the lines, here's what we notice. There will be two conversations between God and Cain. We will also notice when we read the lines that Cain is just awful the whole time. He's actually really a horrible person. He gets jealous and angry about the sacrifices, as we've already seen. He will deceive and murder Abel. Sorry, bit of a giveaway there. He lies to God. He denies any responsibility to care for his only brother. And unlike his parents, Cain never confesses. Cain is concerned only for his own safety, and he shows absolutely no concern about being in a healthy relationship with God or with anyone else. This is Cain. Really bad. God, on the other hand, as we'll see in the story, is faithful to Cain nevertheless. In the Garden of Eden story, we saw that God is faithful, loving, and caring even when we humans are at our worst. We just talked about that. But with Cain, worst has gotten even worse, if that's possible. And yet, as before, we'll see, God preserves Cain's dignity, and God provides protection for Cain before sending him out of Eden, but after Cain has behaved about as badly as you can imagine. And I will try to show you that, as with the Garden of Eden story, there are many clues that this Cain and Abel story is intended also to be an archetypal story, with Cain functioning as a symbol for what can go wrong with us all. So that's what we will find when we actually just read the lines. So let us proceed. Let's get back to the text. Remember that there are two conversations between Cain and God. Here's the first. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." And that's the entirety of the first conversation. That might look to you at first like it's not a conversation, just one character talking. But in fact, as we all know, communication is verbal and nonverbal. And it is Cain who started this conversation by having an absolutely grumpy look on his face. And so what God is saying is in response to something Cain has already communicated, his anger and his envy. And that got communicated with his face, his facial expression. Okay, then Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. And that's it. That's the only description of the crime. It's very short, and then we get back to the second conversation. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother, Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear." Notice Cain's first response is just, "This is not fair to me. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who found him would kill him. And again, we should avoid the temptation to read between the lines and ask, what is that mark? Because the author of this text has no desire to explore that question. The point is the protection that God provides, even when Cain is behaving as he is. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Okay. I promised you some clues of the symbolism, that this story was designed to be, probably intended to be an archetypal story. There are symbolic names again. Abel means breath or temporary or meaningless, and certainly Abel is only a very temporary character. In fact, I believe it's the same Hebrew word that is translated meaningless at the beginning of Ecclesiastes. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. That's Abel. Nod, living in the land of Nod, as we just heard at the very end, simply means wandering. That's what the word means. So that when you combine that with the fact that Eden is related to the word delight, that last sentence could be read this way. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of wandering, east of delight. And as we just said, notice that the Israelites in Babylon were living in the land of wandering, east of the promised land. But the most powerful hint of all comes from the literary structure. And for that we're going to have to shift gears from thinking about contrasts with normal ancient Near East, and it's going to look inside the text and notice what the literary structure is showing us. Okay. I listed in a previous video different devices that ancient authors used when they were carefully structuring their story, and one of those is parallelism. Parallelism means using similar phrases or structures in different stories, and that links the two stories together, showing that in the author's mind they are related. The point in this case is that through parallelism, the author is purposely linking Cain and Abel to the Garden of Eden story, and I will show you those links, and there are many of them. I'll show you those links in just a moment, but that means that if the Garden of Eden story is an archetypal story, something like a parable, where the listeners, the original listeners, would have not just listened to a story, but listened to their story. It would have been set in the past, yes, but it would have been about the now. If the Garden of Eden is like that, then the author's intention is that the Cain and Abel story should be understood that way also. Let's take a look at all the links between the Garden of Eden story and then the Cain story. There is only a brief account of the actual offense. They took the fruit, they ate it. And again, just a brief account. Out into the field, killed him. God questions rather than commands. Where are you? He called to the man and the woman. And to Cain, where is your brother? The man and the woman deny responsibility and blame others. Cain denies responsibility, but also claims ignorance. Notice that what's happened here is that the man and the woman, at least they want to know things, but Cain is just claiming that he knows nothing at all. We've gone from wanting knowledge to just sort of claiming ignorance. God says, "What is this you have done?" God says, "What have you done?" To Cain. God talks of desire and mastery. You might not have noticed that in the earlier Garden of Eden story. But God says to the woman, "Your desire will be for your husband, but he will have mastery over you." And then God says to Cain, "Sin desires to have you, but you must master it." So these two words are used clearly in the Hebrew, clearly linking the two stories. The ground is cursed. Cain is cursed. There is the loss of God's presence. Cain experiences the loss of God's presence and the loss of the land. The man and the woman lose the food blessing, but they still at least have family. Cain loses the food blessing and family. The man and the woman recognize that they are vulnerable when they realize they are naked. Cain recognizes he's vulnerable when he says, "I will be killed." So in response, God provides clothing. God provides a mark. Adam and Eve are sent east of the Garden of Eden. Cain is sent east of the entire land of Eden. Remember that the garden is inside Eden. They were just removed from the garden, but they were still in Eden. But Cain is now sent east of Eden. The progression is east in both cases. Okay, it is obvious then that the original author basically saw the Garden of Eden story in the left column and the Cain story in the right column as basically the same song in a different key, if I can put it that way. It is It looks maybe like two different archetypal stories, but it's so closely linked that we could even consider it just one archetypal story in two chapters, literally the way we have chaptered the Bible, designed to show the progression of dysfunction, the progression of breakdown, when people turn away from the minimal restriction that is designed to ensure flourishing for all. Another indication that this is meant to be an archetypal story rather than something like history is how often these four names, Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, show up in the rest of the Old Testament. Adam shows up only a few times in the rest of the Old Testament after this story, as a place name sometimes, as a person at the beginning of a genealogy sometimes, or as just the Hebrew word is just translated mankind, which could also be the case at the beginning of the genealogies. Eve, after the Cain story, shows up never. Cain, never. Abel, never. So that is an indication that there is something going on in this archetypal story that is not like the rest of the history of the Old Testament. Okay, in all of Eden, creation story number 2, the Garden of Eden, and then the Cain and Abel story, in all of this, we have seen many primary concerns addressed. What does freedom look like? How can freedom coexist with restrictions? What is morality? What should the relationships be among people, God, and the world? What characterizes the male-female relationship? What is the character of God? What is the source of societal breakdown? All of these things are addressed in this story. We've looked at some of them deeply. And the way these concerns are addressed, the delivery method, if you will, is what looks like two archetypal stories, but may just be one. The parallelism indicates that it's just one. It is set in the past, but it's about the now. And what did we learn? And this is going to be, again, somewhat repetitive. This is some review, but I think it's really, really important to hear this over and over. The ancient Israelites did, and that's how it sank in. Let's contrast two screens worth of contrasts between ancient Near East and what's being proclaimed in early Genesis. In other words, between normal and the gospel of Genesis. The cosmos exists for the gods. That's what's normal. But no, the cosmos exists for people as a gift. There is no account of the creation of woman. There is more time spent on the creation of woman than on man, and creation isn't good until the woman arrives. People spring up like a patch of weeds or like a herd, but people are family in the gospel of Genesis. People exist to serve the gods, but astonishingly, in Eden, the people are served by God. The male-female relationship is hierarchical. That's what's normal. But no, says Genesis, the male-female relationship is ultimately what it should be, is a side-by-side relationship. Class distinctions are baked right into the world by the gods. No class distinctions. This prayer of anxiety, I don't know what is right, I don't know what is wrong, I don't know why the God I know or don't know is oppressing me. It's simple. We do know what to do. We do know what to do, and we can count on God's good character. This is the gospel. Now let's move to yet another screen's worth. Morality is relative. It's based on pleasing the gods who change their minds all the time. Morality is absolute, based on the unchanging goodness that is the character of God. Normal. Freedom means absolute freedom to do or to take whatever you want. The powerful exercise this freedom over the weak, as Pharaoh did, and that is symbolized by the serpent. But freedom, as we saw in that triangle, means these three things in perfect balance, and that was symbolized by the situation of mankind and womankind in the Garden of Delight. The boundary between the gods and humanity is fuzzy. We didn't talk about this much. We will in a future video. But one thing we can say is that reading the Eden story, that there is no confusing people and God. That's just not possible. It's a very strong and important distinction. The kings and the pharaohs can be like the gods. That's part of this fuzziness. The kings and the pharaohs can be like the gods, but trying to do that is what leads to the loss of freedom for all, and that's what leads to breakdowns in our relationships, our important relationships with God, with people, with the earth. And in the last row, the gods are vindictive, but no, God is forgiving, gracious. He insists on maintaining our freedom and dignity even when we sin and are at our worst. And again, this is the gospel according to Genesis. That gospel was proclaimed first to the Israelites in the first valley and was written down ultimately, it turns out, for our benefit in the second valley. And we can be very, very grateful that that gospel according to Genesis that was proclaimed first here, that was written down here, is now still able to proclaim good news to us today. And for that, we are thankful. Well, that concludes our treatment of the Eden story. So stay tuned. Next time, we will turn our attention to the flood story as this series starts to near its close. Until then, rest in the goodness of God, and goodbye for now.